Are you able to see my screen, Sonia?
Give me a second. Yes.
Okay. Looks like people are starting to gather.
Excellent.
Give it just another minute for people to finish coming in.
Sure. Joe, do you think there are going to be people that was at the workshop in DC with it on data visualization? Remember the one?
Mm-hmm. Possibly. I'm looking through the people who have signed in thus far. And a couple.
If you can send me the list afterwards, that would be useful for me to know who was there.
Will do. Yes.
Thank you.
Certainly. Yes. Okay. Looks like we have have kind of a decent selection of people. I recognize lots of names here. So great. So thanks everybody for coming out. Just kind of a quick notice, this session is being recorded. So the only faces that will display will be mine and Sonia's, but so you won't be recorded in that sense, but we just want to make you aware that Big Brother is watching. Hello everybody, and welcome to the 5th entry in our series on digital think tanking in times of COVID-19. My name is Joe Miller. I'm the director of the Washington, DC studio of Soapbox, and I'll be chairing today's event. So just before we kind of dive in, a programming note. This is digital think tanking in times of COVID-19, and one of the realities of COVID-19 is that sometimes one of your presenters gets it. So we had planned to have Alex Engler with us today, but he is currently getting tested for COVID. We all hope that he will be okay and make a speedy recovery. But in the meantime, what this means is that you get to hear extra from Sonia today, which I can tell you is always a treat. So you are quite fortunate here. So for those who are new to our program, our series brings together 3 really amazing communities of think tankers from Germany, the UK, and the US. So I'm flattered to be here as a representative of 2 of those groups, WonkComms and Soapbox. So I've been involved with WonkComms since about 2013, so shortly after it started up. It's a community of practice for people working in think tank and policy research communications. The group's been active in the UK for about 8 years. Its US counterpart is a little newer, but we've been still pretty active. So last year I was lucky enough also to join Soapbox to help launch its presence here in DC. Soapbox is a design studio that specializes in working with people who use research, evidence, and ideas to make the world a more peaceful, prosperous, just, sustainable, and equitable place, which is to say we specialize in working with think tanks. We're also joined by the German Council on Foreign Relations, whose Impact and Innovation Lab has been busy bringing together think tankers from across Germany into a community of practice. So this is, again, sort of one of, while there have been many downsides to COVID, one of the neat things is that it has enabled these 3 communities from 3 different countries to all kind of come together around this series. So I have not actually started presenter mode, have I? Should probably do that. Yes. So we're here today to talk about the role of numbers and data visualization in the times of COVID. So before we get too far in, just go through a couple of quick technical details. It's hard to imagine anyone who doesn't know how to use Zoom at this point. I think we all spend most of our lives here, but just in case you're all started out on mute, but it's always good practice to mute your microphone. And you can, of course, switch your view between speaker view and gallery view, depending on what you want to see on your screen. So you should also feel free to join in the conversation. There are several different ways you can do that. You can join us over Twitter. It is Digital Think Tanking, so we encourage you to tweet during the event. Nobody will be offended. There are hashtags you can use to kind of join in the conversation. There is a Q&A. We have a chat. So in the chat, you can drop in your questions at any point, and we'll, when Sonia has finished her presentation, we will kind of run through those questions. You can introduce yourselves. One thing to note, so we ask people to put your kind of your name and your organization in the chat, just so everybody can get a chance to kind of know who else is around. One thing to notice, Zoom has changed its preferences. So right now, by default, when you send a chat, it only shows up to me and Sonia. So if you change the default, there's a little blue toggle down there at the bottom, and change it to everyone, so that you can talk to all of your fellow participants as well. And finally, there are some surveys. We'll have one that we're going to start right this minute as soon as I find it. There we go. Please. So you can should be able to see it up on your screens now. It's just a couple of questions, getting your kind of letting us know what your experience is around data visualization. So let's see. Those of you who've met me know that there's really no subject that I won't turn into a discussion about philosophy. And so this one is going to be no different. So I want to take just a moment to talk about three different concepts. My boring philosophy stuff. So there's data, the ostensible subject of our conversation. This is just stuff that happens. So it can come from a lot of different places. You can think about, say, sounds coming from a pulsar or responses to a survey. Data is just what is. It doesn't tell us much. It's just kind of stuff that's there. Data turns into information when it's put into some sort of context. So we might build a theory to explain sounds. We might explain survey responses by comparing them with previous responses. And then you get knowledge, and information turns into knowledge when it gets integrated into the kind of the rest of our belief system. So when it moves from being information to being sort of part of the way that we think about the world. So, for example, I could tell you that 20,500,000 jobs were lost in the United States in April of 2020. That's a piece of data. But now suppose I show you this, right? This, now you have context for that piece of data, right? So this is the monthly job loss numbers since the 1930s in the United States, right? You can see this piece of data is really significant, right? So this chart takes that piece of data and turns it into information. And that's a big part of what we really do as think tankers in general. It's honestly kind of an amazing role to have. And today we're lucky to have Sonia here who can help us get better at doing that. So Sonia Jalfin is the founder and director of Sociopublico, a communication studio that spreads complex ideas. I should put up her little quote. Sociopublico helps knowledge producers such as think tanks, international organizations, and academic institutions to communicate their work globally. Sonia studied sociology at the University of Buenos Aires and communications at the London School of Economics, where she received the Merit Award. And I've been lucky enough to attend several of Sonia's presentations, and her slide decks honestly just always kind of leave me speechless. So I'm going to hand over the floor to her in just a second, but right now I want to just very quickly take a look at our survey, which I have just ended. It looks like in terms of where people are in the audience. We have about 19% who build bespoke data visualizations. We have, let's see, I can just share these things with you. Yes, about 12% who say they're pretty good with Excel. Nobody here who, looks like we don't have any researchers here, so nobody who is sort of the statistician, but doesn't really deal with charts. Big chunk of people who are happy to say they build basic charts, and a handful of people who say ACK numbers, which is probably me, to be fair. So, and then has your organization had to try harder on data viz because of increased COVID-related data visualizations? It looks like most of you are in the kind of not really category, so we're still doing sort of business as usual. So that's kind of a good look at who we are in the group. And now I will stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Sonia, who's going to tell us some really cool things about data visualization. So, over to you.
Thank you, Joe. Hi, everyone. Let me quickly go to my screen so we can start. And with all this propaganda, I'm not sure I will be yeah, to fulfill the expectations that Joe has created, but I'll do my best. So hi everyone. Are you seeing my screen? Is that working well? Excellent. So let me quickly introduce myself. The orange bar is me. The yellow one are my parents, and we are in 1975 when I was born. The height of the bars show our degree of happiness at every moment. So now you will see that mine will go down because my brother is just about to get born. There he is. After that, my parents got divorced, so they split into two different columns with negative degrees of happiness at the time. Then during my teenage years, there's a lack of information because I was not paying that much attention to my family. Then I fall in love and I had my first son and then the second one. And now you will see how's my life during COVID and a lockdown and all that. So basically I'm a person who believes that every story can be told with data and using data visualization. And in that sense, I could say that I'm really, really happy and excited right now because we data visualization fans have got into, as Joe was saying, we got into the front page of the New York Times recently. So these are glorious days for data visualization. And also we, some very, very strange things are starting to happen, like data visualizations are being translated into many different languages. Here are two examples you might have seen. The first one on your left is something that was published by the Washington Post, and it was so successful that they actually decided to translate it into 10 different languages. And then you have an example from a Chinese newspaper that it's published in English, and also they have decided to do a version of this data visualization in Spanish. So this is like when Netflix has a new release and they decide to do it globally, that's happening with data visualizations. And we even got to be into the video graphics of almost every news show in the world. As you can see here, like the idea of flattening the curve, which is such a technical concept, is now in every screen. So I should be very happy, but I'm not that happy because there's always some killjoy. And in this case, I think the killjoy is our brain. Because our brain, even though there are so many data visualizations around there, our brain has its same limited capacity to absorb all this information. And let me do a very simple experiment here. Can you please tell me in the chat who of you feel that your brain is doing more than one thing right now? And please be honest. If you are, at the same time you are watching me, if you are replying to an email, or if you are watching to your phone, or if you are just taking notes on this same presentation, please let me know if you are doing more than one thing at this moment, if your brain is busy doing more than one thing. Let me see what you say. Okay, I'm trying to look at the, oh, I can't see, oh, here you are. Let me see. Okay, yes, guilty, taking notes, many of you, great. I love that you are honest about this, because yes, it's true. Most of the time, our brains are trying to do more than one thing at the time. So we are usually like doing stuff 1, stuff 2, stuff 3, and these days also Corona stuff all the time. And the problem is that if you read something about neuroscience, we now know that our brain cannot work like this. Our brain is not well prepared to do many things at the same time. Actually, the way we now know that our brains work is that they work like a bottleneck, because it is not true that we can do more than one thing at the same time. What we do is our brain turns on into one thing, for instance, this presentation, and then it turns off, and then it turns on again onto another different thing. For instance, the notes you're taking or the email you are replying to while you listen to me. And the thing is that our brain can do this very, very quickly, and that's why we have the perception that we are doing the two things at the same time. But actually it's not doing the two things at the same time. It's doing it in a sequential, first one thing, then another one, then first one, then third one, then back to the first one, and like that. So that's what leaves you very tired at the end of the day, because that's your brain turning on and off many times very quickly. That's what at the end of the day makes you feel tired, because that's really energy consuming for us. So my question today, given that all our audiences have brains like this, that looks exactly like ours and have the same problem, my question here is whether database can help us uncork some brains. If we can use them to find the space or to find the spot into some people's attention, into our audience attention. And I think the database can be helpful, basically because it is usually helpful to go from something like this to something like this. This is a real example. It's something we did at Sociopublico, which is the communication studio at RAN. We do many data visualizations there and many other things to help complex ideas spread. And so one thing we do, and I'm sure most of you do all the time, in a very concrete way or using different tools, but you generally go from this kind of information to something that it's comprehensible, that is, as Joe was saying, is information that our audiences can consume and understand. So let me go through three main ideas, I think, that can help us use data visualizations to uncork some brains. But to do that, we need to use visualizations in a certain way. I mean, not all visualizations are helpful when we want to capture the audience attention or to make ideas understandable. So the first opener I would like to suggest today is that you use your data to do something useful for your audience. And this works because we are all very egocentric when we consume information. So if you picture yourself scrolling through your feed in any social media you like to use, you probably know that you will keep on scrolling, and you will only stop if there's something there that you feel that solves a problem for you or relates very, very directly to something that's important to you. And that's something you can do when you use data. Try to organize the data around the user, organize that data to try to solve a problem for your user, or we could say use data as a service. And actually data is quite useful and malleable to do this, maybe more than other kinds of content. Let me show you some examples. And these are all COVID-related examples I brought today. So this is a map someone produced showing the width of the sidewalks of New York City to help you decide where should you go for a walk if you want to maintain social distancing. So if you go into this map, you will see that the red sidewalks are the ones that are thinner with less space, and the blue ones are the ones where you will have more space. So you have to go up north a little bit. There near Central Park, you will find some space, but there are also many red streets there too. So this is using the information that was there. Actually, this was an open source data set that was already there. Someone decided to organize this information to provide the service, which is let you know where should you go for a walk in these times of social distancing. Let me go to the following example. This is something that ProPublica did, using information of the available beds that are in every hospital in the US. And here they use geographical information to refer this data to the audience. So it works very simply. You can put your address there or a city. There I put New York, and then you can see how many beds are going to be available in New York on certain different scenarios. They had 3 different scenarios, with one with 20% of people infected, another one with 40%, and another one with 60% of people infected. And then you can see how the health system is going to respond in every case. What it's interesting to me is that when you have geographical information, you can always do this trick. If you have any geographical information, you can always ask people to put their address and see what happens around them. Let's go to the following one. Okay, this is something we did at Sociopublico, and I promise I'm not putting many examples from ourselves, but this one I wanted to include it because it is a very, very simple one. It's not even a visualization, really. It's something we did only in 1 week for governments in Latin America to start sharing information on the prices they are paying for health supplies. So we did that with the Inter-American Development Bank. And what we did is basically organize this database that looked like the one I showed you before, and add some filters and add a search box so that the governments that are going to, for instance, to buy alcohol, they can go there and look how much are other governments paying for that particular health supply. And then you can go into the details and see how many units they bought and when was this transaction done and things like that. So it is simple, and it's solving a problem that many governments are facing right now, but it is not fancy data visualization. It's just a table with a search box. Okay, so opener number 2. And please, if you have questions, you can put that on the chat box, and then we can talk after this. Or if you have a very, very urgent question, you can always interrupt me, that's fine too. So second opener, you might like to add some text for numbers avoiders. So this might feel a little bit counterintuitive, but even though I'm a great fan of data visualization, I am aware that data visualization or charts in general are much more difficult to read than plain text. I mean, we've been all educated to get to read and write, and most of our audiences are going to be feel comfortable with that, but not all of the people in our audience are going to be comfortable reading a chart, even a simple chart. So, and then there's another additional benefit of using text, and it is that text adapts very, very well to mobile screens. So it is really responsive. And so you wouldn't have the problem that actually the New York Times used this chart to show the death toll or the unemployment, both of them. And they used this in their favor because that chart wouldn't fit in the front page. And that's something that happens all the time when you work on digital data visualization. You want your visualization to be mobile friendly, but it's really hard when you have a variable that varies greatly from the other ones. It's hard to put your little bar to fit into the screen and at the same time be accurate to the data. So text can help you with that. And let me show you some examples. This is also data as a service. It's something that Quartz did. And here you can look for your local bank branch and see what are the odds that this branch might close. given this current crisis. So here, so this is the article. And then when you get here, you can put your address. I put the address where I usually stay in Washington, DC. And the system replied with the branch I use. And then there's this text, and this is actually enriched text that it's enriched by data. This is not plain text, but it's a text that is responding to my question. So this text is now talking about the exact branch I put it in the map, which is the branch I use. And it says, I won't walk you through the details, but it says basically that there are many chances that this bank branch will close before July. So I should look for another one. But what it's interesting here for me is that when you have data, you can always present your data in text, but those texts don't need to be something that's going to fit all. You can use your text to personalize the data and answer a question of your audience. And then some important stuff for people who are only starting to do some data visualization, maybe just embedding simple charts into their reports or publications. If you, I mean, you could remove the visualization itself and only use texts. And if you're going to put a visualization, you might like to remove some other stuff. Or what Edward Tufte, a professor in data visualization and a great master of this art, he called that data trash. All the other things that we tend to add to our charts and are not useful for the audience to understand the important information. What can you remove? Almost everything. Look at this chart. You can remove the background, the redundant labels. You can remove the lines, the borders, the colors, and just because you want the eye to look at one particular bar. The bolding is something that's generally not helpful at all. The lines, as I was saying. And then you have a much, much better bar chart than the first one. So we can now compare the two of them. And I'm sure you will agree with me that the second one looks much better. It's much more understandable. So subtracting information or even subtracting the whole chart and putting some text might be sometimes a good idea. So let me go to the third and last opener. Use data to build stories, scenarios, even fiction. I'm sure you are familiar with this idea of using stories to present our research, to tell our audience about complex ideas. This generally works also because of neuroscientific discoveries, because we know that we tend to relate more easily with narratives and with stories. That's what Kahneman called the system one, is the system in our brain that connects very easily with an image or a story of another person without thinking with our more analytical brain, which would be system two. So this might also feel a little bit counterintuitive, because when we think of data, we think we are talking about facts, reality, and critical thinking, but data can also be a good channel for us to tell stories and then maybe get into the analytical thinking. But if we want to open the brains of our audience and get them to connect to our content, we might want to start, even if we're working with data, we might like to start telling a story. And data is a great channel to do that. It's also very flexible to help us tell stories. Let me show you some examples again. I was talking about fiction, even building fiction with data. This really sounds counterintuitive, but the New York Times has recently created this fictionitis, which is a disease they have invented for us to play with different variables and see actually how coronavirus might perform, what might happen. But they created this illness, and you can play with it, and you can decide which the RO might be, the death rate, and then see a simulation of how many people would get sick with this illness you have just created. And I think when you remove the coronavirus and you start talking about a fictional illness, then this becomes much more playful. It invites you to participate in a way that feels safe. Another example that I invite you to explore later is to look for, in Google, look for Nicky Case and his explorable explanations. He produced these cartoons and animations to explain complex ideas and build simulations. There's this simulation now on how the COVID is transmitted and what happens when more people get ill, and when can you achieve herd immunity. But this is all told with comics and animations and simulations and characters. So going again back to this idea of storytelling, when you use characters, people and you embed them into these stories, then it's easier for your audience to relate to that. So look for a Nicky Case. And then something we've seen a lot these days with the coronavirus crisis is that we can use data visualization to show us different scenarios, or to show us things that we wouldn't see in reality. So again, there's this idea of data being something very real, the actual truth, but actually data can help us imagine other possibilities and look for things that are invisible. This is an example of something that the Washington Post did, showing how when someone coughed in a plane, how the viruses might spread. This is quite scary if you travel a lot like me. And then there are these very beautiful pieces of art, like this one done by Reuters, showing how the air got cleaner over time from January to March. And they have used these visuals that are inspiring, that they show us something that we wouldn't see. I mean, if we look at the air, we wouldn't see something like this. And talking about stories, let me use this final example, and this is something we did ourselves. This is a game, and I think when you can also do games with data. This is not related to the coronavirus, but we were working with a fact checker to see how many female judges were there in the Argentine judiciary system. And we found out that there were only a few. So we created this game, which is actually only an animated GIF that we put on social media. And the only thing you have to do if you want to play it is to try to stop this GIF when you spot a woman. And it is really hard. And it also provides you an experience, because it makes you feel how hard it is, as hard to spot a woman as it is to become a female judge in Argentina. So you can experience the data by playing this game. And I wanted to include this example because this is something that it's really simple. It's actually only an illustration that represents the actual data, but it's only an illustration and then an animated GIF. And if you're only starting to produce data visualizations, you can maybe start by doing something like this. So be useful, add the text when you come, and build stories, and hopefully with that you will be kinder to others' busy brains like this. So thank you.
Thank you. That was really wonderful. So I'm going to maybe abuse my position as host ever so slightly by asking the first question. So suppose that I don't have access to a fancy data viz designer. So a lot of the people who are in our audience said they're they make basic charts, like they're pretty good at Excel. So is there some kind of something or some small set of things that I can do to really up my data viz game? What are kind of the low-hanging fruit for kind of taking my data visualization up a level?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, there are many tools that are free and very, very easy to use that can let you do things a little bit more fancy than Excel. But the first chart I show on my family, and the one I showed to introduce myself, was done with a spreadsheet and using Google spreadsheet, and that's it. So it's much more like an Excel thing with some other narrative. So let me differentiate this. First, if you have a good narrative, maybe you don't need something very fancy. You just need to put the charts and make sure that they are tidy enough. I mean, that you don't add any unnecessary 3D things or things like that. It's better to have a very simple chart that it's easy to read and then add some story to it or progression or use them to tell a story. Then if you want to do something a little bit more fancy, there are several tools. For instance, Flourish is one, Data Wrapper is another one. And then you can use them to build charts that are a bit more sophisticated, or maybe with some interaction with labels that will pop up with hover or things like that. And the third possibility is to reach to your communications agency, because sometimes doing things like this is not expensive, it's very simple. And you will find out that maybe doing a video is much more expensive, and you can go with an interactive visualization that nowadays is not that difficult to code.
Cool. That I'm actually going to follow up on that because that's very similar to another thing I was wondering. So you mentioned coming to an agency, or going, maybe it's an external one, maybe it's your internal comms team who has some data visualization capacity. So what does that look like? So do you just walk in with a spreadsheet and kind of throw it at somebody and say, here, go make magic happen? Or what's the kind of relationship you need to have between kind of your data visualization expert and the subject matter expert who really understands the data itself? Mm-hmm.
Well, data visualization is such a collaborative deal, because you need people who understand design and visual presentation, and you also need people who understand data, and that's sometimes the researcher who worked with the data. So even though when you work in communication with data visualization, you tend to learn a lot about data, we are always very humble, because we know that the researcher who's been working with that data is the one who knows best what stories are there. Maybe we can help them decide what should decide on hierarchies or how to organize the story, but he will know where is the interesting part, the thing that is really new, that it's going to catch the attention of other researchers and the audience in general. So it is a collaboration, basically, between the researcher, someone who knows how to sort the data, and someone who can design, and maybe someone who's going to be coding that to make it interactive.
Great. So John Schwartz asks, do you think the COVID crisis is making the general public more data literate? Is it making our jobs easier?
It's a great question. I think many people has learned what does it mean to flatten a curve. So that's something. But I'm not sure whether there's going to be more literacy. I'm actually, even though I work with data visualization, I'm quite skeptical about how many people really dig into a complex data visualization. I mean, when you look at these great contests, like Information is Beautiful or things like that, where you see very complex data visualizations, these are pieces I really love and I admire, but I think they are sometimes not that useful to get into the general audience, because it is hard to dig into those visualizations. You need time, and sometimes you even need to learn the language of that particular visualization. How are they using, I don't know, the forms, the shapes, and things like that. And contrasting to that, when you have a bar chart, everyone knows how, not everyone, but many people knows how it works. So I guess it depends on who do you want to reach. And I'm not sure whether there's going to be much more data literacy in our audience after the COVID crisis, but maybe some aspects of it.
It's interesting. There's a lot to be said too about the, you mentioned kind of the shapes and having to kind of figure those things out. There are, as I understand it, there are better and worse shapes. So some things where kind of humans are pretty intuitively able to compare, and some things, yeah, our brains just have a great deal of trouble kind of wrapping around size differences. So,
yes, that's another great question. we now know, going again to neuroscience, that seems to be my topic today, that we are really bad at comparing shapes in general, like the surface of a shape. For instance, it's quite frequent now to see charts showing different circles to compare a certain amount. And actually we can find out very easily if one circle is bigger than another one, but we are very bad at estimating how much bigger. I mean, if you see two circles, you can say this one is smaller and this one is bigger, but you cannot say this is 3 times bigger or 2 times bigger than the other one. But when you compare lines or bars, that's much easier. I mean, in that case, for our brains, it's easier to see if one bar is that has a size that has a double length as the other one. So that's another great piece of advice. Try to avoid shapes, and that's even worse when you look at 3D pieces. So that's why if you are going to put a bar chart, put a plain one. Don't use 3D because that's not going to help your audience to understand the data.
So no pie charts, is that the,
yeah.
Is that the takeaway? Okay. Let's see, Claire asks, and I'm going to try to read this, but my eyes aren't what they used to be. So I'm wondering how we can make sure that our data visualizations aren't misleading. So for instance, in the national news, we now always see comparisons of corona infection data between countries, though these are often not actually comparable due to differences in testing and counting methodologies and even just population sizes. So how do we, this seems in some ways like another question about data literacy. How do we make sure that we're not kind of lying with our numbers and kind of reassure our readers that we're not lying with our numbers? Yes,
that's really important. If you work in a research environment, I'm sure you are very familiar with the idea of being very responsible for your information. And so as I was talking before about removing all the extra stuff, one thing you should never remove is that the piece of information that refers on the data itself. Actually, these days we are talking a lot about adding something like a nutrition label for data. As when you buy a product, you want to see how it is composed. You might like to know how the database that data visualization is using is composed. So it is great to add when the data has been collected, when has it been updated, of course, where, how many people has responded, or things like that, that can give context to your data. That is increasingly important. We've seen many examples of wrong comparisons during this crisis, but even before that, because the other aspect of this conversation is that we are gathering much more data. And I've been thinking a lot about how these days that we are all the time online using Zoom, for instance, we are providing the system with much more data than 2 months ago. Our kids are playing games online all day. They are going to school online. So there's plenty of data, particularly data on children consumption, digital consumption. And as you probably know, many of the big tech platforms, they love to use data from children because they are the audience of the future. They are the ones setting the trends. So as much more data is available to private companies and to governments, then we need to be much more careful on these aspects, ethical aspects of the data we use, and be very clear to tell our audience where this data is coming from and what does it contain exactly. So the idea of adding these nutrition labels, I think it's wise, and we should start trying to do that.
Great. Let's see, we have Mark who asks, the FT seems to have mastered the art of convincing readers of the power of data visualization as a means of communicating to readers. But otherwise across media, the power of data visualization seems not to have penetrated. Would you agree?
Well, yes, I do agree. A couple of years ago, I talked to an editor at the New York Times who was a big champion of data visualization, and he told me in secrecy, but I think I can reveal that now, that actually data visualizations were not great entrance for the audience in general. I mean, not many people will dig into a data visualization. It is hard. And the reason that I think newspapers are using them a lot, it's because they need to be at the front line of this of this art, and they are competing among themselves. And when you have such a data-heavy environment as we have now, and we need data to understand, and they want to present the data in a fancy way. But it hasn't been proved that the audience engage more with data visualization than with other forms of information presentation. And actually, we've been exploring and experimenting with other tools. And for instance, chatbots seems to be working well to engage people and to inform them, and also to provide them with data. And it's easier for the audience to engage and stay connected with a conversation than with an interactive data visualization. Having said that, you can combine the two, because as I was saying before in my presentation, when you use data and use data to build a story, to build a conversation, then there are chances that your audience stay with you for a longer time.
Your work on chatbots is really just phenomenal. And when I have you come back, it just impose on you and make you come back and spend a whole hour telling us all about chatbots at some point. So Tom Jeffrey asks, let's see, it almost went away. So uncertainty is a key problem when communicating about coronavirus. Do you have any tips on how to come back? Have any tips on how to adapt visual communications to be clear about the limits of our knowledge?
I think that's a great idea, and Tom, you should do it. I mean, I love the idea of a data visualization that fades in and then fades out and leaves you with some questions instead of certainties. I think you can use data in creative ways and taking out this idea that data is always equals certainty. And you're right. These days we have no certainties. But I'm thinking, like, for instance, if you use text, I mean, we received so much more contradictory information. Like, for instance, at the beginning of this crisis, using a face mask was not necessary, and now it is necessary. Or I don't know, touching a surface might be a way to get the illness, and then it is not a way to get an illness, and then you have to disinfect everything you get from the supermarket, but then that's not like, and we've been receiving all these contradictory messages all the time. So for instance, I imagine you could build an article with all these alternative sentences, and I don't know, for instance, showing randomly a different sentence to every user as a way to convey this feeling of uncertainty we have. I mean, you can use data in playful ways, even if it is to tell people that data is not certain, or that you have no certainties.
That's a really nice segue into Claire.
And if
asked,
Tommy is not going to do that, maybe I'll use the idea. I love it.
Yes. Claire asked, just kind of following up on that, do you have any advice about how to visualize qualitative data? So things like from an interview or literature reviews, things like that. Yes, I
won't be able to find it very quickly, but I saw yesterday an animated video from Al Jazeera with telling the story of one day in the life of a health assistant at a hospital in New York. I can find that later and put it in the chat. And it's so moving and well, interesting, providing you with information, but at the same time, immersing yourself in the experience of this person. That, of course, video and animation, it's great. In this case, like the whole story is based on the narrative of this person going through his day. So he's just saying, I woke up this morning at 7 a.m., I poured some coffee, walked through the door, and things like that, and then you see that. So you can perfectly do that with an interview. If you have the interview with a good quality of sound, then you can add, and the good thing with animation is that you can go beyond the limits of reality. I mean, when you have animation, you can use metaphors. If someone is feeling isolated, you can just put this person in the middle of the screen with a, I don't know, bit obscure background around, and you can really, that's helpful to communicate feelings and use metaphors for that. And then I saw another example, a bit much more based on data, but I can't remember now who did that, but I can also check that later on. This was in a newspaper. They were playing with different scenarios for the ethical treatment of patients. So they had these illustrations of different people, and what you will see is that if these 3 persons come into the hospital and you use this rule, who is going to receive the attention first and things like that. So they were using animation or illustration, but to simulate different scenarios for the treatment of these people, depending on the ethical rules that the hospital decided to use. So that's another example.
And it just kind of ties back to your third kind of key point about building stories, right? So it's about thinking about whatever your data is, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, really understanding what the story is that you're trying to tell, and then thinking about kind of ways that you can use visuals to help tell that story. Maybe it's a chart, maybe it's a set of really nice images to go along. Yeah, like that. That's really interesting, and really nice for those think tankers who are working on things like foreign policy, where there's often not as much kind of straightforward numbers to happen, but where you don't want to just put out a thing that's 30,000 words and that's it. Nice. Looks like, I'm not sure I see any more questions. There's some nice comments about our nice kind of discussion about data visualization in the media. Tom notes.
Yeah, let me say to finalize maybe that what I think it's great about data is that you can always, I mean, you can think that data is inflexible, but it's actually really flexible to help you build stories, because you can do with data some stuff that you couldn't do with other pieces of information or reports. You can always arrange data around your user instead of arranging it around the average. Like one example I like really much is that is one that has been done by the blog Flowing Data. I will put it here. I'm actually putting in the chat all the things that I'm mentioning for the ones who want to go back to that. So Flowing Data is a great blog that builds, Nathan Yao is the author, and he builds his own data visualizations. And some years ago, he got this database on the causes of death in the US during the past 50 years and the ages of death. And I think that some years ago, if any newspaper got this database, what they will do, and maybe now it's the same, what they will do is to look at the average and then present the main trends to the readers. Like, for instance, people tend to live longer, they tend to die, I don't know, at 80s, in their 80s, and they die from cancer more than, I don't know, any other illnesses. But instead of doing that, what Nathan Yao did was throwing a little interactive box where you can put if you are male or female, your age, and then it will tell you when are you going to die. So, and suddenly, of course, this is the average. Now, if I put I'm 44 and I'm a woman, and then it would say that by my 60s, I'm likely to be alive, but when my generation reached the 100 years old, then we are all going to be dead. But the way it is organized, I mean, it's the same information, but it's organized in a way that for me as a member of the audience, it's unavoidable, because there's nothing I care more about than my own life. And that's not because I am egocentric, it's because all of us are, and we pay attention to things that speaks very, very directly about our concerns. So instead of saying when is people going to die, if you just change that title to when are you going to die, it is probably going to work much better to connect with your audience.
That's really lovely. That kind of nicely encapsulates all three of your points right there in that anecdote, right? Tell a great story, connect with your audience, you know, add the just a little bit of text. When are you going to die? As you know, kind of a powerful bit of text. Thank you. And thank you so much for, we're closing in on the top of the hour. And so I know folks will have other places they need to be. So I want to say again, thank you to Sonia for, with an hour's notice, agreeing to fill up the whole hour instead of only half the time. So thank you very much for your both agreeing to participate and for the great insights. I have a very quick, before people head off, we have just a short little bit of feedback. So just a little poll. It's all of 2 questions with like 3 answers. So you know, if you don't mind filling that out. For our next event, we'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about evidence-based policy advice. So looking at relations between science and policy, which should be really fascinating. I believe the link to register is in the chat right now, so you can go ahead and grab your spot. So thank you everybody for your time today and for all the great questions, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Thanks everyone. All right.